Let's be honest, few humans enjoy meetings, and many feel trapped in meetings. As leaders, we don't want to burden those we lead, but meetings can seem to do that more often than not. We wanted to address the pain of meetings through the Meetings with Saints library. Here we have 15 plus presentations dedicated to improving the meetings we run. We have experts in the field addressing topics like getting people involved in meetings, staying on task, dealing with conflict in meetings, and a ton more. We'd love you to explore the full Meetings with Saints library over 14 days at no cost to you. You can do this by visiting leadingsaints.org/14. That's leadingsaints.org/14. We'll also give you access to all of our virtual libraries that educate about other leadership topics. It's really good stuff. So visit leadingsaints.org/14 or click the link in the show notes. Greg Matsen, welcome to the Leading Saints podcast.
Well, thanks. Appreciate the invitation.
Yeah. And you are a fellow podcaster.
I am.
Or
yes.
a YouTuber. I mean, how do you, when people ask about your platform, how do you describe it?
Well, I probably say podcast. A YouTuber, I think, usually has a, not maybe leaning more toward like TikToker or something.
But, oh, yeah. So you're definitely not a TikToker.
No, I'm definitely not a TikToker. My kids kind of introduced me as a YouTuber, which is supposed to be funny. So I usually go by podcaster.
Nice. A little more, there's you can be taken more seriously.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Hey, there's a little bit of substance there.
Nice. So what's the name of your podcast and how would you introduce it?
Yeah. So it's Cwic Media. And then I run, the show is called Cwic Show, but Cwic is an old English word. Some people call it Cwic and some people Cwic and other things, or think it's an acronym, but it's an old English word that means intelligent and alive, kind of like being quickened.
Nice. And you try and create some content that will help people be more intelligent and alive.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, nice.
Exactly.
Now, there's some people listening to this and they think, oh, Kurt, you made the mistake of inviting Greg Matsen on. He's a radical right winger. I mean, but I think people don't understand maybe who you are, and it's easy to label people nowadays, right? Yeah. So, I mean, how do you, because you get into a lot of politics, a lot of, current issues in the news as they pertain to the church and to BYU and whatnot. And so how do you describe sort of where you're at on the political spectrum?
The spectrum.
Or is that maybe not a fair way to frame it? I don't know.
I think the spectrum is kind of interesting. I do think that there is a natural spectrum, I suppose. I think most of it is the overlay of that, though, is mostly man-made. I am not a fan of party politics whatsoever. I have not been a part of a political party for 25 years. I believe in being independent, and I don't really support either party. Mm-hmm. I think some people might think that I call a right winger or something like that because of the issues that I cover. Mm-hmm. And so for me, one of the threats I see out there is a hard left return to kind of the 60s and 70s radicals. And so I do cover that a little bit, and it's a concern of mine, but I would have the exact same concern if the culture was moving toward a hard right position, and have brought that up several times and try to let people know on the channel, on the podcast, that this is not party politics. And I don't care to demonize people or politicians. I rarely cover anything like that. I want to cover the issues. I want to talk about them, and I want to get them out there. I think we have to get ahead of a lot of these issues, especially in the church, because this is something that I think will be entering the church more and more and more. And we need a platform platforms to be able to discuss these things and not be taken by surprise with them.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of people, I want to be clear. I mean, obviously I'm a a white male from Utah. And so I don't think it's any surprise if I identify as a very conservative politically. And I appreciate listening to your content. I think part of it, I'll admit that you have a lot of maybe biases I do, or sometimes it's like, Greg's feeding my own dog food here. This is great. Right. But you do help me see things in a way that I hadn't considered. And I think you do it in a way that even those that consider themselves more progressive would say, okay, I'm listening, Greg. I don't agree with you, but I'm listening, because you do it in a way that you're not just getting on the latest talking point and pushing that and saying, and everybody else is stupid, right? Like, right. Is that a good way to, approach?
I hope that's right. I really like hearing that. I appreciate that. I think it's, I'll give you an example. I was meeting with a number of BYU students yesterday, and sitting down and talking with them, and we were talking about solutions and perhaps what a messaging, right? Messaging, and the what we talked the most about was a positive message, right? We need a positive gospel-centered message in bringing some of these political issues in and leading with that. A lot of times, I think people on the right seems to fill the role oftentimes of being reactionary. And, you have the left that kind of pushes out a little bit. They open up the boundaries somewhat, and then the right kind of reacts. And I think if we can focus more on the issues, get ahead of them, and talk about them intelligently, open up the platform for people to discuss them from both sides of the aisle, I think that's the way to go. If you go out and try to be reactionary, you end up trying to demonize ad hominem attacks, and it's just not very fruitful. You kind of preach to the choir. Yeah. And there is this feeling like, and some may be listening and thinking, Kurt's just having somebody closer to his ideology on the podcast. But, I refer people to like the Blair Hodges interview. Like I've talked with a lot of individuals who would classify themselves as liberal Latter-day Saints. Then anyway, so I encourage people towards that. But there is this feeling, and some people blame, Ezra Taft Benson, but there's this dominant outlook on the world of politics as more conservative and Republican. Maybe some people even go there, but is that, that's hard to deny. And, you mean within the church? Yeah, within the church. And from your standpoint, why is that? And is there a good reason behind that? I think looking at things, I think a lot of it has to do with what came around in the 60s, in the 70s, because what you see there was a radical movement. And that's what's returning, right? You've got the same radical icons of the 60s and 70s that are being held up and putting up on a platform and being used for curriculum and K-12 and other places. Like a radical, progressive movement. Like in the 60s. Yeah, I would say progressive is soft compared to what I would say. Okay, sure. On some of the individuals. And so I think what happened was, again, the church reacted. And went harder the other way and said, no, this is anti-family. It was basically sex, drugs, and rock and roll at the time, and don't trust anyone over 30, and all these other things that were going on then. And so there was a turn. That's where you see the honor code at BYU came about, with the grooming and some of the other things that they laid out in the honor code. And that's also where you started seeing a lot more of, even in the curriculum of the church, you start seeing the screws tighten down a little bit on the manuals and things that were used, where there was much, much more meat and references and a flow of a lesson, for example, that was given, because there was kind of just a tightening down of trying to, there was a counterculture movement that I think the church did not agree with. Yeah. So what would you say to that? Like the conservative group in the church who maybe are headed too far to the right, or they think, this says in the scriptures that, that this is a chosen land, the United States. And how can you be a Democrat and a Latter-day Saint? It's just impossible. Like, what warnings would you give to that group? What I would say is, I love what President Nelson is doing in talking about gathering Israel. And when you think about what Israel is, and he talks about God, God prevailing, let God prevail. It's It's gathering individuals that are going to be committed to the gospel and creating a Zion people. That has nothing to do with being a Republican or a Democrat. That has nothing to do with Fox News or MSNBC. And so if you keep that in mind, that, hey, you might need to stretch a little bit. That doesn't mean you compromise, but you might need to stretch a little bit and open up your mind a little bit and say, okay, it's really interesting, because if you go back and you look at some of the stuff that when President Nelson gave his talk in General Conference about gathering Israel, part of that talk was about racism. And he had those both together in the same talk. And what I've seen the brethren do in those instances is before they get into the talk of racism, they start talking about first an identity as a child of God. And so it's something that we all share first. And we can all have this, we can think about our identity hierarchy, so to speak. They seem to be laying that out very clearly. Look, you can be of a certain race, a certain skin color, a certain sexual orientation, whatever it is, but above all of that, you're a child of God, and that's your first identity. And so I think that if we can keep that in mind, what is more important? Is it the country? Is it your politics, or is it gathering Israel? And if you can put those into the right, proper hierarchical structure, then I think it works fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with, being patriotic. Obviously, I mean, you've got Doctrine and Covenants that support the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, the founding of America, with that it's inspired, and those documents are inspired, and they are a gathering point in a sense, for really the world. But stretching yourself out beyond your politics, stretching yourself out beyond your tribe, so to speak, I think is a very big part of gathering Israel. Yeah.
And you mentioned, as far as the importance of getting ahead of some of these issues that often are in the political context. What do you mean by that, and why is that important?
There's, to me right now, the political charge is right now coming from the left. In the past, it's been from the right. But right now it's coming harder from the left. And so it's been mostly incubated in academia. And so in many ways it's been, and for the most part, since those 60s and 70s, it was more of a fringe thing even in academia. But that has been fostered to the point where it's developed much, much more, where I would say that really culture today, it's not coming from the media, from Hollywood, or those places are building off of academia now. And so really the producer of culture is academia. But because it's in the universities and not as much originating in other higher levels of communication, it's been kind of quiet to a certain degree, until suddenly you have George Floyd and then COVID and all these things kind of happen at once. And then it's like, boom, where did all of this come from? Well, it's been there. It's just not been at a high enough, call it a social conscious level in the U.S., because it's been held up more in the universities. Yeah.
And what would you say to maybe the more liberal or progressive Latter-day Saints who say, well, the problem with our church culture is a lot of that direction and force is coming from the right side of politics, even though in the media it's coming, maybe they agree or don't, that it's coming from the left. But some would say, well, that's the problem in the church and showing up, is that the subtle influence of political thought is coming from the right through Sunday school class or whatever it is. I mean, is that?
I think they're right. Yeah, I think they're right. I think that is true. I think it does happen. And the best statistics I think we've seen are that we are still somewhere probably around a 70-30 in the U.S. split of people leaning right compared to people leaning left. 70% right, 30% left. But I'll tell you a quick story. I remember several years ago I was in the bishopric and I was sitting in a high priest group lesson. And this was in a more conservative area and a lot of members in the area. And the teacher gets up there and he starts talking about what do we need to do to help our conservative movement within the church, because look at what's happening. And then he brought up several points that were probably, current events that he probably pulled from Fox News or something like that week.
Sure. Yeah.
And I looked around and I know, a few of the members of the high priest group there that lean left. And I saw them just rolling their eyes, and okay, you just eliminated a number of individuals there in that quorum that how are they going to participate with this unless there is? So I said something to them, and I said, look, the gospel is not conservative. The gospel is not liberal. The gospel is true, and something to that effect. Uh-huh. And so if we're going to talk about an issue, let's talk about the issue, but the politics probably need to be left out of this.
Yeah. And that's the interesting question that coming back to sort of the core topic of this podcast is, as far as like politics and church leadership, especially like local church leadership. I mean, I don't think any bishopric, elders quorum presidency, relief site president wants politics to come in, but that, maybe through one comment in a Sunday school class, or sort of a rogue teacher in an elders quorum instruction that maybe says something like that, then it's like, so is it easy enough to just say, we're just going to keep politics out, or it's so ubiquitous that it's hard to do that at times, right?
I think it's very hard to do it. And I think we're going to have to come up with new ground rules.
Yeah, I
really do, because we're becoming more and more politicized, more and more divisive. The left is pulling harder left, the right reacts and pulls harder right. And so it's concerning to me that there will be divisions within wards. I get a lot of feedback from people about things that are brought up in church and young women's class and elders quorum, and from the pulpit even, where more and more it seems to me that political issues are being brought up and names are being dropped, political figures are being dropped in fast and testimony meeting, or your elders quorum or relief society, and it's like, whoa, this is,
or even in a prayer, and
or even in a prayer, sure. So it's very concerning, and you start thinking, well, how do you? Is this something that's going to grow? Is it going to be more pervasive? And if so, how do you handle this without, thinking, well, you're just on one side or the other, and because in the U.S. we're becoming so much more divided in politics, and I think it is an issue that we need to be ahead of, mm-hmm. and note that it is coming. I get messages from bishops and stake presidents and just ward members that are really kind of alarming in what is being brought up, and different books that are brought in for lessons and political books. And so it's difficult. It's going to be a difficult thing to address.
Yeah. So what advice would you give to a leader, a lay leader in a bishopric or stake presidency, what should they do in order to stay ahead of the issues or be aware of the issues?
I've thought a lot about this, and I don't know if I have a solution to that yet. That I would feel comfortable with, at least. I think that one thing is just mentioning that we need to keep politics out, mm-hmm. and that we don't need to be discussing certainly party politics or individuals or any kind of an icon that would be representing one side or the other. Probably shouldn't be mentioned. Mm-hmm. in church. There's a different place for it. And, one thing I decided when I was getting into this was that, for example, I was going to separate things even on my social media. So I've got a Cwic media page with a bunch of, Facebook friends and, stuff like that are on there that are different from I've got a personal page that's completely different. And so I don't put anything political on my personal page. That is about relationships and keeping up with people and et cetera. And that way I've got another platform where I can go out and I can, I don't know if that's very practical for most people to do, but it's a great solution for me.
Yeah.
It works really well.
So as far as like keeping politics out of, our church experiences, it's easier said than done, Love, because to one person, an issue is just a general love one another issue, maybe like, Black Lives Matter, mm-hmm. or But to others, that's a highly charged political issue, and people see that more as an organization, a politically charged organization and whatnot, where other person's saying like, no, I just want to make sure I am loving everybody of every race and whatnot. Or on the other side, it's like, well, no, we're talking about the U.S. Constitution and all the amendments because President Oaks talked about it. We're talking about an elders quorum, and there may be some on there saying, no, this is way too political than it needs to get. And so would you say it's easier said than done as far as keeping politics out of these church?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. And, there's two sides to the coin on that because, Joseph Smith used to say something along the lines of, look, let people speak. We want to hear from them, even if they may be incorrect and we can correct that, but let people speak a little more. It's more like what we have with the Come Follow Me manual now. It's very open. There's not much in there.
It's more like a guide than
it's like, if barely, it's so opposite of what we used to have. Same kind of thing. It's like, okay, it seems like the church is trying to foster that a little bit more and probably look for more discussion in lessons, for example. So I do think there is merit in saying we need voices and we need different perspectives. I just don't know that we need to get too political. Talking about Black Lives Matter is probably, I would think most people would understand that's a pretty politically charged, and probably going to bring more contention than the Spirit.
Yeah, rather than maybe a core doctrine of just loving one another, and even though race or anything is not mentioned, right? But then there's then that's when it gets caught up. People saying, no, but we've been charged by President Nelson that to root out racism, so we should probably talk about it in elders quorum or whatnot. Right. But then it just so quickly turns political, right? And these are sort of impossible situations, I guess. But
I guess I'm kind of waiting still for kind of the follow up. On those talks.
And we're recording this the day before April 2022 conference.
So there may be something there.
By the time people are listening to this, they know that we got it, or I don't know, but it's tough. So I think that, that's such an open statement. It's a very true, and that's usually, I think what you get from the brethren is kind of very core principles and general principles from general authorities.
General principles from general authorities. Some people interpret that one way and some people interpret it a very different way. And so, Kurt, I don't know. I think it's going to be something that leaders are going to have to really grapple with and try and figure out. And I think there's going to have to be more direction from church headquarters on how to handle these things.
Yeah, because it is, it's easy to sort of have somebody, being, and maybe you're in a bishopric and you're in a Sunday school class and somebody says something and then it's like, this has gone political. I think I'm supposed to shut this down. And then, you try and do that, but it turns awkward and then nobody wants to speak. And then everybody just tries to forget that hour until the next week. We'll just reset and pretend that never happened. But to me, it's like, we just let the conversation unfold. And if you're noticing that politics are more and more of a thing, or there's sort of this bad guy, good guy discussion happening in the context of, political parties, then, prayerfully address that the best you can. But these are really tough situations in general, right?
I think they're tough situations. I think, whenever I've been in a position of leadership and something like that has happened, what I've noticed is that if you can turn the discussion back to a core gospel principle, someone brings up Black Lives Matter and you go back and you talk about the Book of Mormon being inclusive of everyone and gathering Israel and the gospel will go out to the isles of the sea and, being inclusive, and go back to gospel principles and try and get it away from organizations. And like I said, when you bring up individuals and you bring up organizations, that's probably not going to fly very well. But if you can bring it and turn it around to a positive, what are the core principles of the gospel? And let's talk about those. And how is race with race? How do we love one another more? If we could just talk some basic principles like that, then it does turn the conversation away from being political and into more of a gathering Israel, right? And more of a gospel-based discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else as far as the concept of, politics entering the ward in church that we haven't discussed yet? Or did we cover it pretty well?
I think we covered it pretty well. I just would say, I get dozens of these examples that's sent to me, and every week, and
on both sides
on both sides,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
and it's I think it's again, we need to get ahead of it. It's going to grow,
mm-hmm.
and we've seen, I think sometimes in the church in the past, you can see where things can fester for a while. And then finally we come out with like the gospel topic essays, right?
Mm-hmm.
And things like that, where we might want to do some of those things earlier. Yeah. Get that out earlier on guidelines and protocol at a ward level on how to handle these things.
Yeah. And I think that my mind just goes to, what I'm learning is this, obviously we're getting this general direction of, politics shouldn't enter these our church experience, these classes, whatnot. But it's messy, as in practice, it's tough because some people may not think they're saying anything political and others think they are. Mm-hmm. And then it just sort of takes me to those foundational leadership principles of, do your people know you? Do they feel like they're heard, that they can approach you? Just these things. If that foundation is there, I think it's going to be easier to discuss and correct if needs be these issues, if you have those foundational leadership principles in place and just focus there, and
yes.
And it should turn out well in the long run. Mm-hmm. Let's hope. Well, let's talk about, as far as you mentioned, social media and whatnot. And I think it was, I don't know if it was the same talk that President Nelson, or in the last conference, just said, don't look to social media for your news or these things. But we live in this world where, when my father was my age, he would watch the 10 o'clock news every night, or the national evening news, and you sort of get the information there. But now we live in a world that's saturated with content, and it's sort of all funnels to social media. And that's sort of the natural, social media is meant to draw people there to scroll. And so we naturally begin to develop opinions and perspectives of what we see on social media. So how do you go about it, as far as like getting a well-rounded perspective of what's happening in the world? Or how do you not rely on social media to stay ahead of the issues?
Well, I think some people would question whether I have a well-rounded perspective of these things. But I think, first of all, my very first recommendation, and I say this often on my podcast, is I would stay away from TV news. First and foremost, that is a formula for to me, it's a bumper sticker world. Its primary focus is to demonize the other side, and then they go sell you products with their commercials, and everything is shortened up so much that it is, they have to hit the emotional points within a certain, a number of times within a segment. And so you get ginned up into this reactionary state of, I can't believe what the other side is doing. Mm-hmm. And it's just divisive. It just becomes more and more divisive. So that would be my first recommendation is stay away from TV news. Secondly, social media is built in a way where the algorithms are going to, when we talk about preaching to the choir, that's exactly what they're set up for. So as you look, if you're on the left and you start pulling up, you're going to certain platforms that are going to be what you want to hear, you're going to get more and more and more of that on social media. So I actually get a lot of my news from social media, but I get it from articles. So what I'll do is I'll go in and I'll follow certain content producers. And I've found that if I'm finding people that are thinking things through and writing an article on them, it's very different from somebody who's just being reactionary to what is happening today and then trying to tell me about it from their worldview. And so that way I can have more of an intellectual take on something. It's something that's been well thought out, even if I don't agree with it. I can see a number of the points. And so I just have, several different outlets, journalists and outlets and platforms that I would say, okay, stay away from the extremes on both sides for this, and then find those people that I think are very thoughtful in their approach on the issues.
Yeah. And that's one thing you do on your podcast I appreciate. Sometimes you'll take that article and say, I disagree with 80% of this, and let's go through and talk about it. And I think this author's missing A, B, and C point, and this is why. And then, again, it's challenging you to process this information rather than just say, well, look at this headline. I can't believe it. Now I'm making a judgment on an article I didn't read. It was just a headline that I scrolled past. Right?
Yeah, we're definitely a headline society right now. And I think if you can, the world is nuanced in so many ways. And if you can find the good in different things and common ground in different areas, I work with an organization now that draws people in from all different political backgrounds. And it's very refreshing. I mean, they're focused on a couple issues that they all agree on, but they have different backgrounds, different political backgrounds. And some people that have always been Republican, some people that have always been Democrat, and it's focused on the issues. And it's so refreshing to do that, to say, well, I'm not demonizing this other side or that side. I'm focusing on this issue, thinking it through. I have people that have different backgrounds that agree with me on an issue, and see something positive in how we can message this and get this out to people. And so I think that if you can just sit and think through the issues a little bit more, and they're nuanced. Things are nuanced. There's not Republicans are bad or Democrats are bad. It's not the left is all bad and the right is all bad. It's where do gospel principles meet up? Yeah. I want to find those, and I don't care where they come from.
Yeah. It goes back to the principle I always remind myself of. And I usually articulate in the context of the gospel of, it's one thing to know the doctrine. It's a whole nother thing to be able to articulate the doctrine. Like, have I really sat with it and processed it in a way that I can stand and deliver a message about it or teach about it? And I think that rings true in the world of politics or news or current events of, do I understand it, or can I articulate my position and why I think as I do? But it's difficult at times because, I have a good friend that, he's maybe the opposite of me politically. And so he'll ask me questions, and I just don't have the time or bandwidth to go out and investigate certain issues enough that I can actually articulate it. So I have to sort of default to a general, to three other people who are maybe pundits, but I know that they've done that and I generally trust them. And so I'm going to default to that position because I don't have the bandwidth. I mean, is that a fair and healthy way to approach things? Or, maybe I just need to make more time for it. I don't know.
No, I think that's great. I think one thing I try to do is, I think dialogue is so important and relationships are so important. So I have a lot of friends that are on the left, and I disagree with them on a number of things, and I agree with them on a number of things. And again, if you're positioning yourself where you're just digging in to one side or the other, again, where TV news tries to try and take you usually, it's you lose that dialogue and you lose the common ground that you're going to have. And I just think that when you go and you think about gathering Israel and you talk about building up Zion, right, that is not a conservative issue. It is not a liberal issue. It's above politics, and it means you have to stretch, and it means you have to look at different things. You have to look at the person first and find common ground on these things. I have a number of people on the left that I interview and that I talk to, and I'll sit there and I'll agree with them a lot of times, and sometimes I don't agree with them, and that's okay. But at least it's discussed. Yeah. We can talk about it. If we stick ourselves in a vacuum of our own political ideas, then it's pretty tough to have any dialogue and make any progress. Yeah.
And, going back to social media, this is the big problem with it, is sort of perpetuates the vacuum. Like you said, the algorithm does that. And then there's not an effective way to discuss an issue through Facebook comments. It almost just gets worse and worse. You may think, well, I'm going to be open-minded and, hey, I see that position differently. And then 10 comments down, you're insulting each other's mother. Like, it's just, wasn't built for that effective dialogue. So we need to find places that are more open and person to person. And
Twitter's the worst, by the way, of all those. Twitter is definitely the worst on those things. And no, I think that's right. Again, it's not thought out. It's not presented in a way that is intelligent. It's bumper stickers, it's slogans, it's memes. Yeah. And it just doesn't get us too far.
Yeah. And I see it. And I wrote a newsletter article around this concept of just the monster of social media, that we keep feeding this monster thinking that we're going to win people over by feeding this monster. Like it may be, you see it a lot when, I'm thinking of in this past year, then Elder Holland had a controversial talk at BYU, and everybody's sort of spiking their football on social media saying, this is why I'm right. This is why I'm right. But there's no space to discuss. And so even if somebody has a point or a perspective or an article that I completely agree with, I would say, do not put that on social media, because you're not helping, even though I completely agree with you. Mm-hmm. There's just it's just this awful monster that we keep feeding, thinking that we're making progress with people, or we're actually going to convince somebody, right? I mean, how do you see it?
Yeah, I think that's right. The problem is that's where everybody's at.
I know. It's the town square, right?
That's already the town square. So you say, well, I'm just going to stay away from that. Or the problem is that's where communication happens. Yeah. And so what I try to do in that situation is two things. If after Elder Holland's talk, as an example, I listened to several podcasts, I read several articles and went through them. And then I felt like, okay, from things I trust that I kind of feel good about and from both sides. And then I kind of could go out and start talking a little bit more about it myself and communicating my points and whatnot, because what social media presents in that instance is so far from what, in many cases, what Elder Holland was even saying. Mm-hmm. It gets perpetuated with a narrative on both sides that is oftentimes not even. I would ask this. I would be very interested to know of those that got to social media about Elder Holland's talk, how many of them went through and actually listened to the whole thing, mm-hmm. and then maybe listened to it again and then made their own conclusions from the talk itself and not from the social media talking points, because there's so often a disparity in what's actually being said there. I do like the fact with social media that you do have, if we included podcasts in there, that where there's an opportunity to have more long form discussion, mm-hmm. whether it's interviews or commentary, especially with YouTube in that case, where something is thought out and it's presented intelligently and open, and there can be opinion there, but it's, it's nuanced and you can see that if in TV news, it's segmented and it's shortened so much that, again, it's the emotional trigger points that they're going to hit. They want the eyeballs. But if you go to YouTube where it's not, TikTok-ish, and you're moving towards something that's more long form and there's mm-hmm. real discussion from it, I feel like I get a lot more out of it. Yeah. But I never go away from the original source. Yeah. I want the original source, and I want to form my own opinion from it. Yeah. And not from what I get on social media.
And this is interesting because we practice these principles, at least I hope we do, in the context of the gospel, that at the end of the day, there's lots of commentaries out there, but mm-hmm. you need to go to the source of the scriptures and contemplate them first yourself mm-hmm. before you, because especially in this content driven world, I'm going to go, see what this professor thinks about this or that, but we really have to create space to go to the source.
Well, and we were talking before we started the podcast, even with the Come Follow Me. Yeah. Right. You've got all of these Come Follow Me avenues, and I'm one of them, right? I do one of those, and it's, and that's great. I think that's, I will say that with Sunday school, you have people that probably at least have more of a background of, hey, some people might even know what we're studying this week, and they've thought about it a little bit, and so maybe they can offer a little bit more and contribute to participate in the lesson. But I hope that we're going back and actually reading those chapters that are mm-hmm. assigned each week, and not just relying on a YouTube channel, to get our perspective.
Yeah, this is something I've struggled with, and I'm sort of challenging myself that sometimes at the end of the week, the only Come Follow Me focus I've had was listening to different commentaries mm-hmm. about it. And maybe if I don't have much time that week, at least I can get just to the scriptural chapter and just mm-hmm. read the source first, and say, because the commentary can be easy to access sometimes rather than that. But and it's
in your car, you're driving, you listen to the podcast, and it's which is great. I mean, it's it's a lot better than doing a lot of other things. And, and at least, again, you're getting some awareness of what is being covered. And in that regards, I think the Come Follow Me program has been fabulous because I think people are more at least engaged for whatever reason. I mean, maybe it's YouTube, maybe in podcasts, I don't know, but people seem to be much more engaged in the curriculum and in the scriptures. Well, in the discussion and commentary of the scriptures, at least.
Yeah.
So that's a positive, but there's so much to liken the scriptures unto with yourself if you're actually getting your own nose in there.
Yeah. So, I mean, this principle should be lived in the gospel and in current news and politics and whatnot. Sure. Like what's the source and what can I better understand? I feel like I've gotten better at that there's this feeling, of taking things out of context and whatnot, or I'll hear something that in my mind, I'm like, I can't believe that person on the left said that. And that's why they're the devil. And, I feel that script is sort of going on my mind. I'm thinking, well, you know what? There's probably more to that. I'm just going to give them the benefit of the doubt and realize that maybe I need to go see what exactly was said before I jump to a conclusion with what the pundits say was said. Right.
Sure.
Before leaving, I want to come back to Come Follow Me, but, as far as like it was social media and posting, and I mean, it's one thing to use social media as to feed yourself content and scroll and see what's on there, but any advice on using it as far as posting and whatnot? Because in my opinion, it's best for the cat pictures, show the grandkids at the amusement park and connect and maybe reconnect with an old friend or whatnot, but there's this article, Greg, and I got to post it and my neighbors got to see this and, the world is burning down. And if I don't post this, like any advice from the posting standpoint, or did we come?
Wow. I don't know. The thing I think about there, and again, I'm in a different situation because I have them split, right? I've got different avenues, different platforms there. But I think the thing that I notice when I see that, like I always know it's usually the same people that are posting over and over and over again, for one thing. And I guess what I would think is, what is most important to me in that environment? Is it a political, am I using that just for politics, or am I using that for relationships? I think, what is your purpose? What is your point on it? And it seems to me like it can be a great tool to add to relationships. And maybe think about that.
Right. No, I love that. And I think Facebook or other social medias have this, mute for 30 days or something.
Yes, that is a wonderful thing.
Don't be afraid to use that. Bless the ward member's heart who posted that thing. But, I'm going to just mute you till that issue passes through the news cycle. Right. Anything else is going back to Come Follow Me. Obviously that's part of, you don't just do politics or current issues, current events or whatnot, but to put together Come Follow Me. And there's a plethora out there. It sometimes feels like, why did you feel like, I should do my own?
My wife told me to do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll move on then.
That was it. That was the number one thing. I had looked at doing Cwic Media for a while, and it was going to be gospel centered, but I was not planning on doing this was before Come Follow Me came around. But as soon as that program came around, my wife says, this is what you're doing. And so that's what I did.
And have you always had a knack for teaching or articulating the gospel? Or
I don't know about it. I enjoy it.
Yeah.
I really enjoy doing that. I've been a lifetime studier of the scriptures and history and philosophy. And so I kind of try to bring some of those things in and get some context to the scriptures. And, but yeah, I really enjoy doing that. And I've kind of been, it's actually not part of my real personality. And my wife laughs about this all the time because I'm not really that nerdy, but I really get nerdy when it comes to the gospel in the sense that I really like to dig into it. And so I enjoy sharing what I've learned.
Yeah.
Right? I enjoy sharing the perspectives that I've gained.
Yeah. And I think you bring something a little different than maybe some of the others, but what would you say, is there something that differentiates you from some of the other commentaries?
So I kind of developed some of these things I call interpreters. And the interpreters are things, I'll give you an example. One of them is is what I call the royal procession. So when you understand in ancient history, the royal procession was like one of the center rituals for a city-state. And it was usually done every year. And so, they did this in the ancient Near East, all over the place. And so, for example, in Israel, you had the procession, and this would be something that would happen during a coronation, and usually during probably the Feast of Tabernacles time. And this is also the time where you had the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, that would happen. And so if you look at that ritual, you can see that the prophets, to me, and this is my estimation, have written around this and brought this in as a context for understanding things. And it changes things, for example, for Easter week coming up. So if I look back and I think, okay, well, the Egyptians used to do this, and they would go move the bark of Horus around the city, several times, and then come in with a certain ritual and coronation. There was usually a sacrifice that was made. Sometimes it was a person. They moved beyond that after a while, and so it was like, okay, we don't need to do that anymore. But sacrifice of a person was kind of center to that, just like with the Savior. And then you look at Solomon, right? Solomon comes in on a donkey from the east into the gates of Jerusalem. Well, that's what Christ did, right? What's happening there? What is going on? And so you can look at that and say, okay, well, he's coming in. There's a procession. There is a way to come in. And he's going where? He's going to the temple to be coronated. That's not what happens, right? That's the irony of the story there, because he does get coronated, but it's secularly coronated, right? He's coronated by the Romans after he cleans the temple. And so it's just a twist on the story of the mocking of him as the king. And it gives you a different perspective when you're talking about, the king of the Jews. What is going on at that time? What is going on with the palms that are being laid down, the garment that's being laid down in front of him as he's coming in in the procession? And then I can go back and I can say, well, I can look at the Aaronic priesthood as a preparatory priesthood, and the Melchizedek priesthood as the fullness, a higher law. And what does the term maybe prepare ye the way mean? Right? Coming from Isaiah and to John the Baptist. And well, what if that way was the procession, right? And I'm preparing the way. I'm removing the stumbling blocks, make his path straight. For what? Well, for the king. I mean, to bring Christ in and glorify him and praise him. And so things like that. You can bring some things in through these interpreters and kind of get a better idea of, well, maybe this is what the author's talking about if I understand what the rituals were in that time. Yeah.
So take interpreter being you're going to frame a gospel story or principle in a way that maybe will help you better understand the doctrine in general.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's an interesting concept, because there's this feeling of, as far as the concept of doctrine, where it seems so basic as far as like, yes, we go to church to learn doctrine, or the church is there to teach us doctrine, but all doctrine, there's core doctrines and there's policy doctrines and things that we can say like, well, make sure in Sunday school they teach doctrine. Like, let's make sure our teachers are teaching doctrine. But I mean, what does that mean to you? Or because it seems so easy, but it often doesn't. It's not. It's not.
It's
right?
not. No, it is. In some ways, it's so nebulous, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it's, and I think it's maybe. I don't know. Is it that way on purpose? I don't know. Like we have to work for it. And
then I think that like leaders feel that pressure, like, is this doctrine? I don't know this, Greg's framing it with this. I don't know if this is right. He seems like he knows what he's talking about, but so sometimes we're not even sure if doctrine is being taught when,
right.
Anyways, I feel like we put too much weight on that, but
yeah, I think, well, look, I mean, there's some core doctrines that we don't mess with. And you have the doctrine of Christ, and his sacrifice and his atoning sacrifice and what that means in our relationship with him. You have faith, repentance, baptism in the Holy Ghost. We get it in 2 Nephi, and we have the plan of salvation. These are things that are pretty core, in eternal families, the temple work. And but what is being said by Elijah and, what happened with, coming up and come follow me, what happened with Moses up on Sinai. What is that? What does that mean? I don't, I think that's where discussion should be had.
Right.
That's where I think Come Follow Me, if people do have some type of a background, it does create more of an environment in Sunday school or elders quorum or Relief Society, young women's and the Aaronic priesthood quorums, where maybe we should foster more of that conversation where people can come in with their ideas and this is what I got out of this. And
yeah. And I appreciate this approach through interpreters or through this framing, because sometimes we don't realize we're doing that to learn and understand the gospel. We're always framing it in some context, whether it's because of our background, how we were raised, or what we majored in college or whatever it is. And because we have this strong tradition of truth we need to teach truth, and truth is synonymous with doctrine almost, right? And so, but framing plays such an important role. And one example I often use is you see of the popularity, even in our faith tradition, of the Chosen TV series, right? And people just, I love seeing Christ in that framing, in that context, and I can relate with him and whatnot. But and even the creators of the Chosen will say, we're not trying to create an accurate portrayal of everything happened, at the time of Christ, but we want you to be able to connect with it. And so we don't reject that because it's helping us connect with Christ on a different level so that we can maybe return to some truths. But sometimes we want to dismiss that. Well, you shouldn't watch that because it's like, it's not true, but it still has a place in our faith development. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think there's a spectrum on that.
Yeah.
It goes back and forth, and we've done it in the church. Yeah. The same thing with the Sunday school manuals. This is exactly the way this needs to be. When they got through, when they created the board on this, it was, they've got very detailed on how this is going to be taught. And you may remember there was a time, and it wasn't that long ago, when it was very focused on, well, are you getting that out of the manual? Is that in the manual? Is that in the manual? And again, now it's just the opposite. It's like it's wide open. So we're on the other end of the spectrum right now. Is it going to go back the other way and the pendulum swing again? It could be.
Yeah.
Because, if things get kind of, it's like you open up Pandora's box and what comes out, I guess.
Yeah.
And so The Chosen, which is series is, I love that series. And it's like, okay, well, what can you put out there? And it's never going to be 100% correct. You can go to any of the Come Follow Me pundits and look, it's not going to be 100% correct all the time. We don't know.
Yeah. But I think just like creating space for allowing people to sort of venture into maybe a framing of the doctrine, even, or a story or whatnot, even if you may not agree to it. And this is something that came up recently on your podcast, of somebody sort of taking a Bible story and framing it in a way that's like, that you completely disagree with. I disagreed. I thought it was a stretch, but okay, like at least let's have a conversation about it and explore, rather than just shutting down and saying, no, you're seeing it all wrong. Let's go back to doctrine. I think there's more going on than just, making statements of doctrine, even though those need to be highlighted so we know what doctrine is. But I don't know.
Yeah, I think doctrine is just tough to nail down in that case. Outside of the very core things, I think it's, and that's why I think there needs to be discussion.
Yeah. Another topic before we wrap up, that I want to touch on is this. You've talked a lot about Brigham Young University, that generation, the young single adult generation, and you've met with a lot of students. And from that, any perspective you could share in general to maybe a group full of YSA leaders or parents of that age that would be helpful?
Wow. So now you're almost getting me to get political on this.
Well, we've touched on a little bit, and we don't need to go there, but I'm just, if there's anything general like that would be helpful.
I just think that I think that, let me put it this way. I think parents need to be more involved, even with the young adults, in these discussions and in these things. And what bothers me is that if you have some students that are young, they're just out of the nest, they go off into the world and they're becoming an adult and they haven't lived in the real world much yet. And now they're given completely different ideas that they were taught growing up in their family home evening and young women, young men's and their scripture study with their family. And then all of a sudden there's this huge disconnect. That's my biggest concern is between the kids and the parents, a division. And, one of the remarks that I get often from parents is even like someone that goes out as a freshman And this doesn't apply just to BYU, but they go out as a freshman and they come back for, to visit for Thanksgiving or something like that. And the parents are like, who in the world is this? This is my child. They just left 3 months ago. And who is this? And they're talking in a different language. They have different words. They have criticisms of their parents. That's where I get some real concerns about different ideologies and practices that seem to be very prevalent and pushed in academia. Advice on, did you say young women's or
like YSA leaders or whatnot? Yeah.
I don't know. I don't have experience in there. I haven't been in a YSA ward in a long time. I come back to the doctrine of Christ whenever you can with individuals. Yeah. Talk about the doctrine of Christ and focus on everyone as a child of God and gathering Israel. I think those are, to me, those are top priorities in your hierarchy of focus. And regardless of what your politics are, you just go back to those basics with those young adults.
And I think with that approach, because there's that worry of like, well, I want to make sure that, LGBTQ Latter-day Saints feel at home here, a place here. And these broader big picture messages can create that space, for them to feel comfortable enough to come sit in the pews with us.
Yes. Right? And there is that, there seems to be on these spectrums of issues like that, again, when you're hitting hard on the other side of this, one way or the other, it hurts those people that need it the most. And so with the LGBTQ issues, it's like, look, if you're going to be extreme and push everybody away because of this very closed idea of what the church is and what the gospel is, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's not what the Lord would do, I don't think. And yet on the other end of these things, I think there's, on the LGBTQ issue, the issue is oftentimes this hope for major change in doctrine and in the church. And I don't know that that's helpful for people either. I think that what we need to focus on is we are all children of God, and the church is a hospital, right? And it's where everybody should be included. Everybody should be brought in. It is not a club of a certain type of person. It should be open arms for everybody. So on that end, it's, be more inclusive, bring everybody in. You don't need to compromise doctrine. You don't need to, bash the church or the leaders. And on the other end, you don't need to make your primary focus of the gospel and the church to change it. I think both sides of that are they're bankrupt in their ideas. Yeah,
that's really helpful. You're currently in a bishopric, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, hard left here, but as far as just your general experience in church leadership, bishoprics, any other like leadership experiences in the church come to mind that bless your life?
I would say the greatest thing is it's kind of from several different avenues, but it's just service. And making a difference in someone's life. I being in the bishopric, you get to work, for example, I get to work a lot with the youth. And that's something I've always loved doing. And I feel that, I think it was Elder Ballard that said at one point in talking about teaching youth, it doesn't even matter as much what you say. It's the relationship that you're building and the difference that you're making in their lives. And it's, do you care, right? How much do you really care about these individuals? And so that to me has been one of the best experiences of leadership is with the youth and being able to go out and hopefully trying to make a difference with them and build those relationships, have fun with the kids, and build a relationship that it just becomes very enjoyable. I look forward to that. Part of the reason I love going to church is just to be around those kids and to talk to them and, kid around with them and just build a relationship. The other end of that is in the ward I'm in right now, we've got a lot of elderly people. And so with COVID especially, there was this separation for them and your only connection with them was on Zoom. And so the ability to go out and spend more time with them more recently and serve them and get to know them a little bit better has been really good. And so I would say the easy answer to that, the primary answer to that is it really is, though, it's service. Just going out and really serving other people and looking at it in a way that is not a checklist. What I have found is it's actually just building the relationships with those individuals.
Yeah. Well, I got one more question for you, but if people do want to check out Cwic Media and the content you're putting out, where would you send them?
Well, I've got a website. It's called cwicmedia.com, CWIC media.com. That's mostly gospel-based stuff there. And then they could go to the YouTube channel, and that's just youtube.com/Cwic Media, CWIC. And then I've got, they can find me on, search me on their podcast platform.
Yeah. Well, and I hope the listening audience has heard this, obviously we talked about politics here, the influence of politics, and I hope nobody felt like we were trying to push a political thought on anybody or whatnot. But sometimes I feel like, especially as a conservative, I feel trampled upon. I don't feel like people sit with my perspectives long enough to understand why I'm not crazy or whatnot. And to me, that's helped me be a better ally in the context of the church, for maybe more progressive Latter-day Saints as they sit in Sunday school and they feel like they're being trampled upon, And so anyways, I hope we'd love to hear from anybody, and I'll forward any message on to Greg that I receive if you have, you want to disagree or whatever. And then I'd love to hear it. Or maybe there's something we missed or something we said.
Let's talk.
Let's imagine that. Let's have a conversation. So Greg, last question I have for you, maybe you sort of already answered it, but I'd be interested in any other thoughts you have as far as your time as a leader, both in maybe a formal church leadership calling or in sort of this self-called leadership role that you're in, producing content, trying to help your world around you. How has being a leader helped you become a better follower of Jesus Christ?
I think, so this isn't something I've ever done before and had never planned on doing until a few years ago. And so what do I know what I'm doing? I don't really know. And I'm kind of learning as I go. And if I keep that in mind, then, one of the things I try to focus on with understanding what the doctrine of Christ is that he was always going to submit to his Father. He was always going to condescend. He condescends below us. So much of what that doctrine is him condescending below. And that seems to, in many ways, be a parallel directly with the idea of love and the love of God. And so what I think what it's done for me more than anything is made me rely more and more on my relationship with the Savior and understanding him and trying to understand the doctrine of Christ more as I go out and bring these things up and try to bring them back to a gospel-centered place. I find that when I am closer to him and when I am in prayer more often, that I feel much better about how I'm presenting things and maybe some differences that perhaps I'm making out there.
Remember, solve the burden of meetings by visiting leadingsaints.org/14 and getting 14 days access to the Meetings with Saints virtual library.
It came as a result of the position of leadership which was imposed upon us by the God of heaven, who brought forth a restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And when the declaration was made concerning the only true and living church upon the face of the earth, we were immediately put in a position of loneliness, the loneliness of leadership, from which we cannot shrink nor run away, and to which we must face up with boldness and courage and ability.